we have to be extremely careful not to over or under-identify students who may need more intensive resources, instruction, and support. We're so fortunate to have Daniel Rector with us this afternoon to help us navigate these concerns. Daniel currently serves on the leadership team for Missouri School-Wide Positive Behavior Support as a statewide coach and district facilitator. In this capacity, he supports schools and districts across the state with the development and implementation of sustainable MTSS frameworks. Prior to this role, Daniel served as a middle school science teacher, a middle school building administrator, and then as a regional improvement consultant with the Heart of Missouri Regional Professional Development Center. Daniel is currently pursuing his doctorate degree in educational leadership and policy analysis with a graduate certificate in applied behavioral analysis. In addition to supporting schools in MTSS and positive behavioral interventions and supports, Daniel is passionate about organizational behavior management, trauma-informed educational systems, and combining opportunity gaps in educational systems and combating opportunity gaps in educational systems. And I, on behalf of myself, Christy Fedden, and the rest of the Nebraska MTSS team, welcome Daniel, and we are just really excited to have you share your expertise with Nebraska this afternoon.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I don't know why I still say that, even though it's like I'm just going to do it anyway. So it's like it's a fair warning that it's happening. And then for those that are in, I'm also going to post in the chat a link. And that link will allow anyone who copies it, you should be able to access the slide in case you want to, I don't know, take notes and kind of go along. So as Christy mentioned, I'm going to talk to us a little bit today about creating the infrastructure for intensified supports. And as I understand, your conference is focused, or your summit has really focused a lot on the integration of academics and behavior and setting the foundation and the framework for how you go about building a multi-tiered system of support. And so I want to kind of dig a little deeper with something that we have been talking about and exploring and figuring out how to help support teams around. And that's the idea that often whenever we build our support framework, we tend to build the systems and then just kind of start putting kids in and letting them go. And we often either don't pause to think about the number of students that we're serving. Are we meeting the needs of our students? And whether or not we're over-identifying or under-identifying. A lot of times, schools that I work with, they build that framework, they start plugging in interventions, and then they start doing the business because, you know, we want to go in and support our kiddos. And before we know it, they've got like 1/3 of the building enrolled in tier 2 interventions. And it's like, whoa, that seems like a lot of resources that we're funneling in there. And I'm not against it if we need it, but let's step back and examine it. So as we dip in, always got to have a triangle. So we're, you know, I've never had a presentation where I couldn't have a triangle, so got to get into it. We know this framework. We tend to think of this framework from an academic and a behavioral lens. The idea that we've got our tier 1 universal, so that's our core instruction. What are we doing to support all of our kiddos? What kind of teaching, modeling, practice, feedback are we giving to every student who's in our situation? And then we start looking at our advanced tiers. And that's whenever we start getting into tier 2 or targeted, as well as tier 3 and intensive. What we're going to talk about today is starting to look at these numbers that start coming out of here. So I'm going to let you in on something that a friend of mine who shall remain nameless kind of shared, that these percentages, whenever they first came out, were kind of a stab in the dark. There wasn't any real idea about what the numbers were. They've evolved over time and have stayed pretty consistent. But the problem with it and why there's a range is there's so much context that goes into what is our percentage and what does that equate to our numbers and how many kids can we realistically set ourselves up to support. So as we dip into this, I want to show you an example of a school that I've worked with. This is some universal screening data that they have. Universal screening is just one mechanism that we can utilize within our multi-tiered system of support to identify kids at risk. What you'll see within here, kind of ignore the stuff on the side because that's just specific to that screening instrument. But this was a K-5 building, and each grade level had 2 teachers. So there was teacher A, teacher B, and then it calculated out a total for that grade level. And then I was able to look at what were those subdomain totals and what was the overall risk totals that we had across each of these grade levels in each of these classrooms. Typically, we use screening data to identify kids and put them straight into an intervention. What I'm going to advocate for and what we've been trying to do here in Missouri to support our schools is to step back and think about different levels of analysis. Yes, we can go through and identify each of the kids that have surfaced across K-5 and put them in the interventions. And for the most part, we're going to experience some success. But we might strain our entire system if we're putting too many kids in interventions. It may not be the best use of how we can deploy these supports for kiddos. And so this data highlights a really good opportunity to think about, rather than putting all of the kids in intervention, how can we more strategically deploy our resources to support the teachers, the staff members, and the students in our structure. And so in this one, we've got a 3rd grade here that in both Class A and Class B, oops, just kidding, pressed a button. Class A and Class B, we've got a high level of risk that's surfacing. And when we average that across, the entire grade level is actually showing more risk than the rest of the school. I could take those numbers of 3rd graders and put them in the interventions, or maybe I can step back and think about, how do we intensify and try to support our teachers and our students from a more practical lens? Over here in the 1st grade, you'll notice that classroom A was demonstrating more risk than what classroom B was, and that overall the grade level itself wasn't showing a higher bubble of risk. So I'm going to ask you to think about, whenever you're looking at your structure and system, these different lenses or levels of analysis. You're going to want to look at your school-wide data. I think we're all really, really good at doing that. We look at our school-wide data, we see how our Tier 1 universals are being implemented, the degree of fidelity, and then we typically jump straight from school-wide to student. And so I'm going to ask us to think about, how can we use our data to also keep a pulse on the grade in the classroom? So that's the big caveat that I have before we jump in here. Now, I mentioned this previously. We've got this triangle, we've got percentages. So how can we figure out a strategic way to use data and to have some decision matrix numbers or data decision numbers at our grace to figure out if we should be targeting the individual kids, if we should be targeting a classroom or a grade, or if we really just need to be targeting the whole school because it's a mess. The next series of slides is going to take us through what that kind of a process would look like. Before I do that, I'm going to ask if anyone, I kind of want to say this, I know Christy put it in chat, but if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in chat. If something's not making sense, you need me to slow down or what have you, just kind of put it in chat, and Christy will help monitor that for me, and then we can take a brief pause and answer those questions. So, projected capacity. Whenever we start talking about our tier framework, what this means is, what would we anticipate based upon our school population, how many kiddos we should be servicing at the different tiers. This number typically will not change unless your student population changes in terms of numbers. So kind of once you calculate it, as long as you're within this frame of reference, you're fine. If you suddenly have an increase in enrollment or a decrease in enrollment, it will change the percentages and the numbers here. Unfortunately, because this is population dependent, your team's not going to have a whole lot of control over what this number is. But it is a good grounding number and a frame of reference for whenever we're building our systems to help us think about how many kids could be serviced or could be needing additional support across our entire school system. And so an easy way to think about how to determine that is to kind of just look at what your total population is, do a little bit of math, multiply out your percentages, and come up with some hard, realistic numbers. I've worked with schools, being an administrator myself. I have a hard time conceptualizing what 10 to 15% is. Whenever I was an administrator, I had a building that was about 680 kids. And so it was nothing for me to be like, oh yeah, we got a tier 2 system that supports 10 to 15 kids. But at any point in time, my building only had 30 kids that we were servicing in our tier 2 intervention. But man, we were in that 10 to 15% range because I never calculated it out and actually compared what those numbers meant and had some kind of a baseline or an idea of where my system is at in terms of what we should be servicing. So this is an example here. This is just a sample middle school that we can talk about. Student enrollment 375. I wish there was a middle school that with that low of a number. They're usually higher. And so what we did is we calculate out for this school what would be some expected range of students that would fall within the tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. So based upon a population of 375, if we multiply that out by 80%, that would be about 300 students. Usually tier 1, those numbers kind of land within the 80 to 85. I've seen some schools get up to high as 90%, which is awesome. They're rock stars. My building usually floated around 83% is kind of where we were at. So you would calculate out what would be kind of the range you would be targeting for your tier 1. For tier 2, we'd kind of look at the 10 to 15% range, calculate what that is. And then for tier 3, we would do the 3 to 5%. And you can see down here, I just kind of put those numbers out to kind of provide a narrative around with it. What this does, whenever you've got it figured out for your school, is this gives you kind of, based upon these percentages right here, the overall numbers, like the actual real numbers that would go into comprising what your structure should be supporting. Now, the problem with projected capacity is it does not take into account contextual variables. This is just pure numbers. If we're shooting for 10 to 15%, we should be looking at servicing 37 to 56 kids within our system. But being a practitioner, being a realistic individual, that's not always the case. In a perfect world, I have unlimited amounts of resources, people, money to be able to throw whatever I need to at an intervention to make it work, to make sure that I have the supports in place to be able to help any kids who need help. In the reality, those things matter. And so that's where this topic comes into play. Your projected capacity has to do with what would we anticipate the need from our building. The serviceable base rate is what can we actually service? What is, based upon all the different variables that are at play and our current resources, what can we realistically do? A lot of times, especially at your advanced tiers, this is going to depend upon how many interventions you have in place. If you've only got one intervention, you're going to have a lower serviceable base rate than what you are if you have actually got a very robust system that has 3, 4, 5 interventions at play. This is going to vary based upon how well you are focusing on your tier 1 as well. Because if you have a lot of great things happening at tier 1 and you're monitoring that and you've really got a high percentage there, your serviceable base rate will be a little bit more manageable in at your tier 2 and tier 3 levels. And then again, other things like time, material, and personnel. So here's kind of an example of how a school might go about thinking about, looking at, and trying to calculate out their serviceable base rate. On the left-hand side of the screen, those are the sample questions, kind of going through, talking about how many staff members do we have available to facilitate the intervention. Then I applied this to a fictitious school. And in this school, they only have one intervention, and that's check in, check out. And so what they did is they kind of thought through at this school, what would be the different numbers that we can service? They only have the ability to be able to free up 2 facilitators to actually run the check-in, check-out process at the beginning and end of the day. As a result of that, based upon what research says about the number of capacity that a good check-in, check-out facilitator can support at one time, they set a cap at their building that a facilitator would typically have somewhere between 3 to 8 students, but that they would not provide more than 8 students to a facilitator. So if I have max, each one of my facilitators having 8 students, and I've got 2 facilitators, that means at total, at peak capacity, check-in, check-out can only support 16 students at any given time. Now, we know that over time, students will fade in and fade out of that process based upon their progress. But our max number would be 16. This school also thought through about a more realistic, if we had kids in check-in, check-out across all of our grades, across all of our teachers, how many students could a teacher, a classroom teacher who is also in charge of instruction for all of the other kids, what is a realistic number of how many students they could take on responsibility for pre-correcting, prompting, cueing, and then providing feedback for at the end of their class period? For this school, they surveyed the staff and they asked staff, hey, we're getting ready to do check-in, check-out. We're wanting to kind of figure out how many kids realistically you think you could be able to provide this level of service. They did some training prior to that survey about what check-in, check-out was and what the role of the teacher would be in that process. And the survey came back and the teachers pretty much landed on no more than 2 students. If I had 3 or 4, I don't know that I could realistically do this to the degree and fidelity of implementation it needs to be done. And so if you think about that, 4 teachers per grade level, they had 3 grades. So the max that they could ever take in, even if they increased the number of facilitators, would be 24 students. And at the time, whenever they were thinking about getting ready to deploy check-in, check-out, this team said that there was no additional resources that they needed. They couldn't identify any more money that would have to go for curriculum, programming, or anything like that. So when they set the max capacity of check-in, check-out, they looked at, based upon our current resources right now, only having those 2 facilitators, the max that we could have would be 16 students. Now, they would look at this each year because maybe they are able to find and bring on more facilitators or whatever, and so that could impact this. But between these 2 numbers that they calculated out, the 16 students and the 24 students, they went with the lowest number as their cap or their max. So that's one intervention. If you've got multiple interventions going on, you would do this for each of those interventions to kind of get an idea of how many students can this intervention realistically support. And then when I step back and look at this from a broader picture, what is the actual amount or capacity that my tier 2 can support students? What's my number? And so this is just an example of a school. They went through, they're doing 3 different interventions. This school was doing check-in, check-out, social skills, and then they had an academic-ish intervention, and I'm drawing a blank on the name, but it was kind of like a study skills, small groups. So think like social skills, but more targeted on academic skills that were at play. And so this school, they were able to kind of calculate it out. In each intervention, they landed on 15 was the magic number. We can't support more than 15 students at any given time in those interventions. So whenever they added this together, what they were able to determine was at max, they were able to come up with their tier 2 being able to support 45 students. Now, this is where it comes as a nice little decision process for teams. You got to look at what it is that you calculated, and you need to compare it to your projected capacity. If your max support level or your serviceable base rate is way lower than what your team is anticipating your capacity, you're going to need to think about the long game. And you're going to need to think about how do we increase the capacity of our tier 2? Because at some point in time, enrollment's going to change, kids are going to come in and go, and we're going to have kids that may rise to the occasion of needing additional support. So what are we going to do to be able to support them in terms of our system? How can we grow it? For this school, they landed at about 45 students, which was kind of mid-range. This would cause them to adjust their percentage just a little bit. They maybe think a long-term about, okay, we know we're going to need to be able to support more kids or have the capacity to be able to support more kids. So let's think through how we might grow one or more of these interventions in the coming year. So projected capacity, which is what it is we can anticipate we might need to support based upon our student population. Our serviceable base rate then looks at how many kids can we actually service based upon our current resources. Now remember, if your serviceable base rate is too low and is nowhere near your anticipated capacity, you're going to need to figure out how to grow your capacity. So then the fun starts coming in whenever you think about your actual base rates. And so base rate, as the term implies, is what is your proportion of students that data is showing you're having a need around. So we go through and we do a universal screener. We go through and we have a teacher nomination process, or we have these data decision rules that we check and look at all of our different data points like grades, assessment, office discipline, referrals, attendance, whatever the metrics are. What are the actual numbers of students that are rising to the level of potentially needing additional support? That's your base rate. What you then do whenever you calculate that is you just kind of look at whatever your process is. Are you using an existing school-wide data process? Are you using universal screening? Whatever that is. After you have your base rate, serviceable base rate, and projected capacity lined out, you're able to then think about what is the best delivery mechanism, given our current reality, on how to support the students that are rising to the occasion. And so this is going to come from Stephen Kilgus and Katie Eklund. They were former professors here at the University of Missouri-Columbia. They have since, very sad face, moved on. Happy for them. They are now at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. They spend a lot of time. Stephen Kilgus, if you're familiar with different screening instruments, he was instrumental in developing the SABRS, so the Social, Academic, Emotional Behavior Rating Scale. They've done a lot of validation with it. And what he found, which is very common with what we find whenever we're working with schools, within the screening land, is our screening instruments tend to over-identify kids for risk. And that's going to happen whenever we're using self-report metrics. Sometimes our perception and our ratings don't necessarily match reality. Sometimes we're comparing them to a different target. And so our screening instruments may get us to the point where we have way too many kids identified. And so his thought process with his wife, Katie, was to go through and think about, okay, rather than, because schools were screaming, I was screaming, everyone was screaming, we can't put all of these kids in an intervention. I mean, the screening instrument alone is identifying 100 of my 300 kids. I don't have the capacity to put 1/3 of my student population into a intervention. And so they came up with this decision-making framework that we've adapted here at Missouri School-Wide Positive Behavior Support to think about, based upon those metrics, your projected capacity, your serviceable base rate, and your base rate, what is the best way and what is the way to target support in the most efficient manner to support not just the students, but also the adult human beings that are trying to support the students in and out of the classroom. We're going to take this and kind of tease it apart a little bit. There's a lot of abbreviations in here. SBR stands for serviceable base rate. Base rate's just written out there. And then there's the less than and the greater than. It's kind of like a mini math lesson almost. But we're going to walk through this. You look at your data, for instance, and let's say we are on the left side. So we exist in a land where our base rate, the number of students that are showing up in our data as needing additional support, is greater than our serviceable base rate. So kids are showing need, but we can only support this many. What do we do? The answer there is, and it's a very frustrating answer, it's been given to me many, many times, so I can empathize, is that you really need to focus on your tier 1 system. Whenever we think about that triangle and we think about that percentage, I'm going to echo something a good friend of mine and colleague, Terry Scott, out of the University of Louisville, what he will say is, we really need to think about that triangle and figuring out how we as teachers can do what we do best. And that's really focus on instruction. At the heart of our multi-tiered system of support is instruction. And so that's what we need to really focus on, and we need to grow that green. So how can we really figure out our most efficient way to grow whatever our tier 1 response rate is even higher? So if I'm sitting at 70% of my students are showing response to my tier 1, how can I grow that to 80? How can I grow that to 85? How can I grow that to 90? The answer is usually always in a very focused attention on instruction. That's usually the answer to anything. It may take us a little bit to get there, but that is the answer. And then what Terry would say is, once you start doing that, guess what? You're solving all these other problems, because there's only room for 100% in that triangle. So if I increase my tier 1 response rate from 70 to 80, 85, I am automatically decreasing the need for students getting into or accessing additional supports. So what we're going to think about here is, any time that we have a base rate that's higher than our serviceable base rate, is what is a problem? And what are we seeing this in? I'm going to speak from the behavior land for just a second. If I'm having a lot of kids who are rising on my decision rules or showing some kind of need around defiance, disrespect, for instance, I'm going to really need to operationalize what that is. What are the exact behaviors that we're seeing? And then step back and look at our tier 1 system. Do we have explicit instruction around a replacement behavior instead? That's the first thing I'm going to ask, because whenever I start seeing high rates of no, naughty behavior, the first thing I step back and go is, oh, did we actually identify what we want them to do instead? Fun story. I helped transition a building from an 8-9 building to a 6-7-8 building. And in that, we revised what our matrix was and everything else. And we fell into a fallacy of putting on our matrix, don't run in the hallways. My friend Matthew, love Matthew. Matthew found a lot of ways to not run in the hallway, all of which were equally incorrect and not quite what we wanted. So whenever we think about, we see these problem behaviors arising, we got to step back and figure out, have we identified or are we clear on what we want instead? And then next level, what have we done to teach it? And whenever I think about teaching, I'm thinking tell, show, do, practice, feedback, all of that. because it's not good enough for us in a behavior land to have a matrix just kind of point to it and say, remember, walk in the hallway. We got to make sure that before we can prompt and cue like that and experience some level of fluency or response to it, that we have explicitly taught and have some reasonable expectation that our kids know, understand, and can do that behavior. From an academic land, if kids are struggling with turning in homework assignments on time, my dog ate it, I don't know what happened, my backpack ate it, we have to stop and step back and go, maybe there's an organizational issue. What have we done in order to explicitly identify how we want students to organize? Have we taught an organizational structure? Have we taught a planner? If you think about it from a math instruction, if we're not figuring out foiling or distribution of our mathematic numbers, then we need to step back and focus in on the instruction. Sometimes we're going to find whenever we do that kind of analysis that we have missed the ball. We are expecting something that we haven't taught. It's not part of our core instructional curriculum. And so that is an opportunity for us to revisit it, teach it, and then hopefully we're going to see a huge amount of gains from that. Sometimes we're going to find out that it actually is in there. So then we start going, okay, well, we've identified what that expectation is, or what that replacement behavior is, or we've got it as part of our Tier 1 universals. What's the degree to which we're actually attending to that practice? Are we teaching it the way that we said we would teach it? Are we reinforcing it the way that we said that we would reinforce it? Once we start narrowing in on that, we're usually going to end up in a very prime position to grow our green. And so that's why if you see your base rate higher than your serviceable base rate, start with your focusing on your Tier 1 system. That's first and foremost. Now, sometimes maybe you're going to land in this middle column, and that's going to be where you're looking at your base rate is actually less than your serviceable base rate. So as a whole, I'm looking at my data, and the number of students that are showing risk is actually below the number of capacity that I have, which is a great problem to have. Typically, when we see that, we jump right in, we start putting kids into interventions. I always ask my schools to pause first and go back to those different levels of analysis, because just because that data makes it appear like our best approach is to stick kids in an intervention, I go back and ask them to look at, is this equally distributed across classrooms and grades? So if you think about your data and start looking at, do we have spikes or pockets in grades, and or do we have spikes or pockets of risk in classrooms? Because an overall school-wide number of base rate doesn't necessarily identify who we need to target, because that could, honestly, it could hide a lot of or mask a lot of data. So in this instance, in that middle, whenever we're looking at that analysis, if our base rate is less than our serviceable base rate, but then we start looking and noticing that there are classrooms that or grade levels that are spiking, then what we're going to think about is for those spike areas or hot zones or whatever you want to call them, rather than putting all of those kiddos into an intervention, how can we more efficiently deploy some supports? The first thing that we're going to ask, this is going to sound like a redundant and a broken record, and I apologize, is how well are we attending to our Tier 1 universal practices in those classrooms? If we find that there is room for improvement, that's going to be our target, because I want us to start there first. We know what our universals are. We just need to intensify and support those getting delivered at a higher rate, a higher frequency. That is a lot easier than me trying to bring in a new intervention and trying to, or a new strategy, a new tool, and trying to teach a teacher how to do that and support them in that process. So I first ask about Tier 1. If there is room for improvement, that's going to be our focus. But then if I find that tier one's actually doing well and we still have this pocket of need, that's whenever I started exploring, okay, what other supports can we put in place here? And I think about my level of delivery here is not to the individual kid. My level of delivery is to the class or to the grade. And so I'm thinking about doing classroom checkup. That can actually is an opportunity to be able to support with tier one universals, especially from a behavioral implementation lens. Maybe we're going to do something more on the academic side and throw out class-wide peer tutoring. I've listed just a few other supports out there. By no means is this an exhaustive list. These are just things that were on the top of my head that I've helped put into place with schools. So that could be an opportunity for us, even if our base rate is below the serviceable base rate, if we're having hot zones, those classrooms or those grades, to be able to attend to them without necessarily having to put all of the kiddos in an intervention. The last kind of lens or level to think about here is whenever our base rate is less than our serviceable base rate, that's a celebration point, but then we're also not noticing that any of our classrooms are serving as hot zones or anything along those lines. That's the prime condition in which we really start moving into targeted or intensive supports. There's no really need for us to deploy a different mechanism system. It's just an opportunity for us to really fully engage with our system. Now, what I ask schools to think about, though, because I'm a continuous improvement kind of person, is that's a great place to live, but I still want you thinking about ways to improve your system because we want the most efficient, effective thing. And so with my schools, I work with them whenever they start getting to this point is, okay, you've probably figured out the over-identification spot because we're no longer over-identifying the number of kids. We're kind of just at that right number. My next question is, because this could be equally detrimental, is are you now under-identifying? I'm going to own it because this is a me. I can't speak to the rest of them or the rest of the teachers or the educational workforce, but I think many people would have a similar vein. We hold on to kids for too long. I think about some of the kiddos that I just spent hours and hours working with them, differentiated, small group, in class, during lunch, before school, after school. And there was always one more thing I wanted to try. There was always one more thing that I could do better to be able to support students with. And in the reality of it is I had an entire support mechanism around me, but I was holding on to this kid for too long whenever I really should have been activating a team of professionals to help support me in supporting that kid. So just like over-identifying, under-identifying can be a problem as well. And so if your projection, for instance, if your projected capacity is 45 kids, your serviceable base rate's actually 50, but your base rate is 12. That is an opportunity for us to ask questions. I'm not saying it's wrong. Maybe your system is so great that your tier one is actually resting at the 95, 96, 97% wrong, or 97, 96% response rate. If so, that is a great problem to have. However, we don't want to assume that that's what's happening. Let's actually dig into the data and make sure that that's what's happening. The other thing that I start asking questions around is overall outcomes from your tier two, and start thinking about these interventions, the demographics of the students that are being served in your interventions. Do those actually match your larger demographics? If your population, for instance, happens to be 27% Black students, we would expect that the number of Black students in our interventions would be representative of that. If you start looking at the demographic profile and breakdown of the kiddos that are in your interventions, if you're seeing huge divergence from your school demographics, one of the questions that I start asking is why? Is there something that is culturally counter in our expectations and what we're teaching, how can we serve this population better from a universal perspective? We start looking at how overall effective are your interventions. Sometimes students graduate from interventions when they're not ready to graduate. Sometimes we have interventions that are not the most effective, and those are opportunities for us to grow. So that's kind of that last little bit. I've got a little bit of time here, and so I just kind of put out a couple examples to kind of see this in action. And so on the far left, I've got 3 different schools that are listed there: School A, School B, School C. They're just kind of fake scenarios. The projected capacity for all the schools is the exact same. There's 375 students, which means that we would expect 300 to 318 in Tier 1, 37 to 56 in Tier 2, and 11 to 18 in Tier 3. The serviceable base rate, they went through and looked at their different Tier 2 capacity and identified the number of students they can service. The base rate talks about the analysis of the data, the number of students that are rising to the occasion and needing support. And then the far right is what should they do in response to their numbers. So if we look at School A, what we're going to see here is that this school should be able to support 37 to 56. They're only able to support 30. So their long goal will be to figure out how to increase their Tier 2 capacity. But if you look at their base rate, especially in this school, they've got 145 of their 375 students identified as needing Tier 2 support. They are not going to be able to serve those kids. They can only serve 30. And so here, what they need to do is, rather than trying to scramble and put all 145 kids into some form of an intervention or make something up or whatever that is, they're going to instead focus on their Tier 1 school-wide practices. They need to grow that base rate response to Tier 1 closer to that 300 mark from where it's at right now at 220. It doesn't mean that they're not going to target skills like what they would at Tier 2. They're just going to figure out the deployment mechanism of that is going to be to a whole group of students, and in this case, the entire school, because they're seeing equal numbers of this across all grades and across all classrooms. If we look at School B, this is an example where they've got a great capacity compared to their projected capacity. And whenever we look at the school-wide level, they've got 45 kids that are identified as needing additional support and would qualify for Tier 2. So in theory, they could put all of those kiddos into Tier 2 interventions and be fine. However, when they looked at the different levels of analysis, they found that the 7th grade, the entire 7th grade, there's 2 teachers here, there's 2 teams here, a Team A and a Team B, that 20 of those 45 students are coming from 7th grade. And it's actually pretty equal across those teams. Then they found that at 8th grade, Team A had 15 of the Tier 2 students, students needing Tier 2 support. So these were really high numbers in comparison. So what they're going to do here is they're going to figure out, how do we continue to sustain our Tier 1 practices, because we're doing great stuff. How do we continue that momentum with our 6th grade and our 8th grade Team B? For any kids that are popping up as needing support from those grades and those classes, we're probably going to go ahead and put them in the Tier 2 interventions. We got them, we can support it, let's go. What we're going to focus on for 7th grade, because it's the entire grade, is we're going to think about, how do we really increase our Tier 1 universal practices there? How do we grow that green? We're also going to think about increasing the universal practices for 8th grade as well. Now, since I've got a team that is showing higher risk indicators, I might also consider throwing class-wide interventions in there to be able to support them as well. I'm going to focus on the Tier 1 first, but I'm going to keep that in my back pocket as a potential opportunity. For School C, this is the dreamland here. We've got 70 student capacity in our tier 2. We're higher than our projected capacity, which is awesome. We're ready to rock and roll. We're only showing 45 students as demonstrating risk based upon our data, and we're seeing that pretty equal across grades and teams. So again, broken record, we're going to figure out how to continue our tier 1 because we're rocking and rolling. We can always grow the green even more, but we don't want to lose momentum. How do we keep that going? And then we're going to start moving and providing supports, moving those other students into tier 3 supports. I'm sorry, tier 2 or tier 3 supports. All right, I'm at 5:15. I'm cognizant of time. Got about 15 minutes here left in this presentation. And so, Christy, hi. Thoughts on questions? And I also want to put this caveat. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. Thank you for kind of listening to my ramblings and everything else. It's really hard to do this virtually. I usually feed off the energy of an audience. So this is kind of weird. Not bad, just weird. And also, Christy saw me do this with a school district where it took me 6 hours to run them through this concept. And her charge to me was, we want that in 1 hour. Go.
No pressure.
No pressure.
No pressure. Well, I want to open up here to some questions, but first, I just am so taken with this concept and with looking at a systematic way of really taking a deeper dive into our data analysis. So, and I know one thing that we've really been watching is NASP has just recently released several publications that cautioned us about this very thing. Really warning districts that we are to anticipate this increase in our base rate, and we know that we cannot manage that at the start of the school year in particular. So again, this is just so timely and such an important and systematic way for us to really address those issues of unfinished learning and understand the magnitude. So go ahead.
I've actually seen a lot of schools pick up on this within their SEL whenever they're trying to figure out how to integrate SEL in there. I've worked with some schools who, without an SEL framework at the tier 1 universal, started identifying kids as needing targeted support on SEL. And so they built these tier 2 interventions without a tier 1 framework. Wow. That took a lot of effort on their part. I'm just going to say it. And we were talking, they're like, yeah, we got this small group going on SEL, and man, the intervention's rocking and rolling. We got 27 kids and they're doing great. And I mean, this is a school of about 200. I said, 27, that's a lot of kids. And I said, that is awesome. Let's celebrate that you're seeing success. And I said, now, I'm going to ask you a question. You're going to hate me, but how many of those kids rose to the occasion of needing an additional support, but didn't have to if we would have figured out how to focus this into our tier 1? And they just looked at me and nodded and said, yeah, but they're doing great jobs at this tier 2. And I was like, and I'm glad, let's celebrate. But yeah, it's that, is the deployment mechanism right? And how can we think about what's good for some is really good for all? If you don't have it at your universal level, let's figure out how to do that there. But that's also the most time efficient, energy efficient, personnel efficient. We can only do so much, especially in our current environment right now.
Absolutely. Those are such important messages. And I think your message of taking away, we've got a lot of people talking, yes, about emphasizing focus on tier 1, core instruction. And I think your message about the cycle of continuous improvement and inquiry is also really important. And in particular, when we're looking at those student groups and we're looking at disproportionality, it's a complex system, but you really have been able to break it down for us and make it manageable. And I wanted to open up here and see if anyone wanted to put questions in the chat. I apologize, I don't want to monopolize your time here at the end, Daniel. We'll see if anybody has questions. So we've got lots of thank yous. Yep, can't emphasize enough the focus on tier 1 core. So those questions, you talked a little bit about working with schools and the work that you did with one of our metro districts in regard to sharing this concept. It does take some time, but I think it's also important to understand that this is something that is understandable. And when you start to break it down, it really does make sense and helps to drive home the importance of the allocation of resources and, again, focusing on core instruction for social, emotional, behavior, academics. So it's really a great message.
Yeah. And I usually, I live in the land of behavior. And so I hope I didn't lean too much in the behavior, because this applies academic, social, emotional. It applies across the board. It's a great conceptualization of this.
Absolutely.
I can't take credit for it. Kilgus and Eklund really came up with it on how to apply this flowchart or decision-making model to universal screening data. All that I've done here in Missouri is figured out how to broaden that from just screener to really think about your tier 2 system as a whole.
Excellent. Oh, we've got another comment from ESU3. Love the flow chart. So yes, they were referencing the flow chart. So great. Well, if we don't have other questions, I will put a plug in to everyone for our closing session this Thursday afternoon. And we'll also put a plug in for next year. We'll be unveiling our dates for the Nebraska MTSS conference next year. And we are hoping that we can have Daniel come back to do a longer than an hour face-to-face presentation and really help us to continue these wonderful conversations about a very important topic. So we're appreciative of your time.
As we're wrapping up, the last slide on here, that's my email. Please feel free, if you have any questions or something about this content doesn't make sense, please feel free to reach out or tap your support there in Nebraska. And if I can work with them, support them. So Christy, if you got something, feel free to reach out, or anybody else from your office.
Absolutely. And we really appreciate it. We'll look forward to continued collaboration.
Absolutely.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all.